My brother stole our family's identities and took out loans, but he has no idea what's coming for him. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when an unexpected envelope arrived in my mailbox. A crisp, official-looking letter from a bank I'd never heard of. Normally, I dismiss such mail as another advertisement, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, I found a statement detailing an overdue credit card balance of $8,732. My hands trembled as I reread the charge. I'd never applied for any credit card, let alone carried a balance anywhere near that sum. I stared at it confused. I never applied for this card. I never spent this money. I sat at my kitchen table. The statement spread out before me amid a sea of unopened mail. The numbers on the page seemed to blur together as panic slowly set in. I rationalized it at first. Surely this must be a clerical error or a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, an ominous feeling whispered that something was terribly off. I immediately dialed the number printed on the envelope. After enduring an agonizing wait on hold, one that stretched into what felt like hours, I finally reached a customer service representative. The voice on the other end was calm, almost clinical, as they confirmed that an account had indeed been opened under my name. Our records show that the Social Security number matches exactly, they stated. My protests and questions were met with a suggestion to file a fraud report. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. A sick, twisting feeling settled in my gut. That very afternoon, I transformed my modest kitchen into a makeshift investigative hub. I logged into my online banking and ordered fresh copies of my credit reports from the 3 major bureaus. I printed every document I could get my hands on: bank statements, transaction histories, and letters from various creditors. Every page revealed more disturbing details. Multiple cash advances at ATMs in different locations, high-value purchases at electronics retailers, and even a brief hotel stay that I couldn't recall ever making. Each entry was a jarring reminder that someone had been systematically exploiting my identity. I could already see the pattern before my mind even fully processed it. Not a stranger, not random fraud. There was only one person who could have done this: my brother Ryan. As I scrutinized the evidence, memories of past family gatherings began to resurface, subtle hints of a pattern I had long ignored. I remembered the way my brother Ryan had always seemed to charm his way out of trouble. Growing up, while I adhered to rules and order, Ryan was the one who'd skirted boundaries. Growing up, my family was far from perfect, but we weren't bad off. My parents worked hard, my dad in construction, my mom in accounting. They weren't cold or neglectful. If anything, they were too forgiving. Ryan was their biggest test. He was the kind of kid who could talk his way out of anything. A natural liar, but a charming one. Whenever he got in trouble, he'd spin some excuse, turn on the guilt, and somehow my parents would believe him. I never had that skill. I was the responsible one, the rule follower. Ryan? He always had to push boundaries. He started small, stealing from my mom's purse, sneaking out at night, lying about school. By the time he was 16, he was getting into serious trouble. Shoplifting, skipping school for days at a time. Then came the drugs. At first, my parents didn't believe it. Not their son. He was just going through a rough patch. He just needed better friends. He just needed another chance. Rehab came next. The first time, my parents scraped together the money, convinced this would be the wake-up call he needed. Ryan stayed clean for a few months, swore he was done with that life. Then he relapsed. Rehab after rehab, relapse after relapse. My parents kept trying to save him. They emptied their savings for programs that never worked. Each time, Ryan would swear he was done. He'd get clean for a few weeks, maybe even a couple of months. But the moment life got tough, he'd sink right back in. Last year, we thought he had finally turned a corner. He got a job at a construction company, started talking about saving up for his own place. My parents clung to that hope like it was gospel, but I knew better. There were signs: his friends showing up at weird hours, his paycheck never lasting long, the way he avoided eye contact when we asked how he was doing. By the time he was in his 20s, he wasn't just using, he was stealing to support his habit. He drained my parents financially, pawned anything he could get his hands on. They still held on to hope, even after every lie, every broken promise. But I had stopped believing in him a long time ago. Then he disappeared, left town without a word. My parents thought maybe just maybe, he was finally getting his life together. And now I was staring at proof that I was right. Later that day, with a mix of trepidation and determination, I called my mother. Her voice was soft and laced with confusion as she admitted that she, too, had received unsettling phone calls, demands for repayment of loans we never took, and inquiries about mysterious credit applications. I heard my dad in the background, his voice sharp, angry. The puzzle pieces began to align, and a bitter realization set in. The man who had been the source of our family's long-simmering heartache responsible for this betrayal. The next few days were chaos. Calls from collectors, letters demanding payments. We spent hours combing through bank statements, trying to piece together just how deep the damage went. Determined not to let this fraud slip into another statistic, I took decisive action. I filed a detailed report with the Federal Trade Commission and reached out to a local detective specializing in financial crimes. Over the next several days, I meticulously compiled every scrap of evidence, screenshots of suspicious online activity, copies of mailed statements, and a handwritten timeline of when the unauthorized transactions had first appeared. Ryan had opened multiple accounts in our names. He had access to everything, our social security numbers, old tax returns, any piece of information he needed. Perhaps before that, he found the documents where all our family's social security numbers and other important papers were stored. As the initial shock gave way to a grim determination, I couldn't help but feel the weight of every misstep from the past. Each missed sign of Ryan's recklessness, every overlooked warning, now converged into a painful truth. The betrayal wasn't by a faceless criminal, but by someone I once called family. But we had no idea where he was. Ryan had always been good at disappearing. He changed phone numbers frequently, burned through addresses like they were disposable. My mom called every rehab center he'd ever stayed in, just in case. My dad checked hospitals, police stations, even jails. Nothing. I scoured social media, but he had deleted most of his old accounts. He had always been careful not to leave a trail. The house felt heavier with every unanswered question. My mom barely spoke. My dad spent his evenings at the dining table, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how much we owed. I kept checking my phone, refreshing my emails, waiting for some sign of him. I wrote a message to Ryan. I know everything. This notification went unanswered for a long time. Then the message was marked as read, but no response came. I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what was going to happen next. After the initial shock, the investigation into the fraudulent accounts turned into a months-long ordeal that tested every ounce of my patience. Each day, I found myself juggling calls with credit agencies, legal advisors, and a persistent detective named Martin, who seemed to have seen it all when it came to identity theft. Martin was a no-nonsense kind of guy, with a steady tone and a methodical approach. He explained that while cases like mine were uncommon, they weren't unheard of, especially when the culprit was someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's life. Family-based fraud is often the hardest to untangle emotionally and legally, he said, his voice heavy with empathy and professional resolve. My days soon blurred into long stretches of waiting for responses from financial institutions. I spent endless hours on the phone, each conversation plunging me further into the labyrinth of bureaucracy. I was forced to verify my identity repeatedly, complete reams of paperwork, and even visit local offices in person. Each delay and each red tape moment heightened the sense of helplessness, as if the gears of justice were grinding at a snail's pace. Every minor update, a brief phone call, or an impersonal letter, felt like a fragile step toward uncovering the truth about Ryan's whereabouts. One dreary afternoon, I found myself in a bland, fluorescent-lit conference room at my local bank branch. Surrounded by stern-faced employees and piles of documents, I listened as an officer explained that, while our reports were still being processed, a series of suspicious transactions had been traced back to a regional financial hub. There's a pattern here, he said cautiously. We've identified several odd ATM withdrawals and online purchases linked to a specific area, a rundown industrial district that most people have forgotten. His words hit me hard. The clues pointed to a neglected corner of the city, a place that had slowly become a haven for the desperate and the lost. At home, the tension was equally palpable. My mother's phone never ceased ringing with anxious updates. Despite all the mounting evidence, she still clung to the hope that Ryan, our wayward son and brother, could somehow be redeemed. "He's still my little boy," she'd whisper during late-night phone calls, her voice trembling between love and heartbreak. But as I pored over financial statements and meticulously recorded every unauthorized transaction, the harsh reality emerged. Ryan wasn't just a troubled youth anymore. He had become a calculated fraudster who exploited every bit of trust we once placed in him. A breakthrough finally arrived when Detective Martin uncovered a significant lead. Sifting through digital records, he noticed recurring IP addresses and cell tower pings that corresponded with the timing of the fraudulent charges. "We believe he's been operating out of a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city," he informed me one cool evening over the phone. His words were both precise and laden with the weight of finality as he relayed details of a location that had previously been nothing more than a vague memory of a dilapidated building mentioned in passing. I grabbed a notepad and scribbled down the address, each line reinforcing the chilling notion that the man who had upended our lives was closer than I'd ever imagined. With this lead in hand, the investigation took on a more coordinated shape. I collaborated closely with my attorney, a seasoned expert in financial fraud, ensuring every piece of evidence was documented and preserved. Together with detective and a dedicated team of local law enforcement, we began the painstaking process of securing an arrest warrant. We interviewed witnesses, compiled detailed timelines, and even had forensic analysts examine the digital footprints left behind by Ryan. The days turned into weeks as we prepared for what would be the culmination of this long, arduous pursuit. Officers were assigned to discreetly monitor the apartment complex that had emerged as our primary lead. The day of the operation arrived with an atmosphere of grim inevitability. Officer Hernandez, the lead on the field operation, briefed us one final time. "We're executing the warrant based on the overwhelming evidence gathered over the past several weeks," he stated calmly. "This is a standard procedure. No theatrics, just a precise and safe apprehension." They surrounded the building and, following strict protocols, obtained access to the target apartment. When the officers knocked on the door, Ryan, who had been inside amidst a chaotic array of discarded belongings and evidence of his hurried lifestyle, appeared disoriented. The realization that his time was up seemed to dawn slowly on him. He tried to escape, screaming, before the arrest was carried out with professional precision. In the aftermath, the legal proceedings began. The following weeks were a blur of court dates, witness testimonies, and the painstaking review of evidence. The trial revealed not only the extent of Ryan's fraud, but also the deep-seated patterns of manipulation that had plagued our family for years. I attended numerous hearings, each one a stark reminder that the machinery of justice is deliberate and often unforgiving. At home, the emotional fallout was profound. My mother's unyielding compassion clashed with the undeniable evidence of Ryan's betrayal, creating a rift that was as deep as it was heartbreaking. My father, who had once been the rock of our family, now seemed diminished by the twin burdens of financial ruin and shattered trust. While the arrest was a necessary step toward accountability, it marked only the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward rebuilding our lives. The trial began under a heavy sky of consequences, with every courtroom day echoing the painful reality that our lives would never be the same. In a modest, wood-paneled courtroom far removed from the sensationalized justice of TV dramas, forensic experts and financial analysts took the stand. Their testimony painted an irrefutable picture of systematic fraud, detailing the digital footprints, the hacked IP addresses, and the transactions that spanned weeks and even months. Every piece of evidence underscored the cold precision behind Ryan's actions. One analyst explained how even the seemingly insignificant timestamps on ATM withdrawals matched a distinct pattern, a pattern that once pointed to a small apartment complex on the city's outskirts. I sat through each session with a knot tightening in my stomach. The courtroom was a crucible where the complex interplay of legal procedures and raw human emotion collided. The weight of every word felt heavier knowing that the betrayal wasn't committed by an anonymous criminal, but by my own brother. In one particularly poignant moment, as witnesses recounted Ryan's early signs of mischief and manipulation, I felt the dual sting of nostalgia and pain. The evidence wasn't just about financial records. It was a timeline of broken promises, missed warnings, and a relentless pattern of deception that spanned decades. As the trial unfolded, legal advisors explained that sentencing in such cases, especially those involving family members, was rarely straightforward. The judge took into account not only the financial devastation wrought by Ryan's actions, but also the psychological scars inflicted on our entire family. In a measured tone that resonated with both authority and empathy, he stated, "Family-based fraud carries an additional burden. It undermines the trust that binds us together. While no sentence can heal these wounds, accountability is paramount." Ryan was eventually sentenced to a significant period of incarceration, coupled with stringent conditions, including mandatory restitution and participation in a rehabilitation program focused on re-education and counseling. At home, the fallout was just as profound. My mother, ever the compassionate soul, wrestled with an unyielding conflict between love and self-preservation. Night after night, I found her poring over old photographs and letters, trying to reconcile the image of the boy she once nurtured with the man who had betrayed her trust. She joined a local support group for fraud victims, where she met others whose lives had been upended by similar deception. In these meetings, her soft, tearful voice gradually gave way to one of quiet determination as she learned to set boundaries and protect her well-being. My father, on the other hand, became a pillar of stoic resilience. Once the robust figure who had always managed to steady our family's finances, he now attended sessions with a financial counselor and even participated in community workshops on identity theft prevention. In these sessions, he shared his experience with others who had suffered similar losses. His transformation was not just about fixing broken numbers. It was about finding solidarity and strength in the face of betrayal. Outside the courtroom, the battle for recovery was equally grueling. I embarked on a journey of rebuilding my credit, a task that proved to be a labyrinth of disputes, follow-up calls, and bureaucratic setbacks. Every day brought new challenges: letters from debt collectors, impersonal emails from credit bureaus, and the slow, often exasperating process of reinstating my identity. I began documenting every interaction in a detailed journal, not just as a record of the financial ordeal, but as a testament to the resilience required to reclaim one's life. The struggle was real and exhausting, yet each small victory, a corrected entry here, a successful dispute there, provided a glimmer of hope.